I'm talking to you though. You're the stats guy.
Yeah, we're trying to.
You're the stats guy, and we're the homies.
What is up, homies? Today we are diving into something that we don't normally do, which is a case study. So there are definitely analyses coming in the future, but my last video with Greg really sparked me to take a deep dive into the life and just the career of Patrick Mahomes, his football life. And I'm here back with my trusty basketball lamp. It's been a while. It's been a while since I brought out the old basketball lamp, but it seemed appropriate because this is a hard-hitting, investigative, statistical journalism piece, and you need a warm glow. You need an air of professionalism when you're doing something like that. So we're going to talk about Patrick Mahomes. There are two parts to this video. The first is that Patrick Mahomes' career has been declining. Ever since his first year of full-time starting, it's been declining. Not very rapidly. He's obviously a very good player. But the first part is I'm making the case that he's not as good of a player as he was in the first half of his career. And so we'll illustrate that. Let's get into it. Enough talk. I'm going to start making my case with some descriptive statistics. So let's just look at his career as a whole, Patrick Mahomes' career as a whole, to better illustrate how far he's fallen. So the first thing is his passer rating. He has an excellent to elite passer rating throughout his career. He's sitting right now at an average of 103.3. Anything over 100 is considered very, very good. And definitely one of the best careers up to this point that we've seen out of a quarterback. In addition, you can see his touchdown passes, 2.3 a game. That's a high number. But mostly I include these numbers so that we can compare. And the comparison is between the first half and the second half of his career. I have excluded this season up to this point and his very first season. But when you compare his first half passer rating average, the first 3 years of his full playing time career, he goes from 109.1 passer rating is pretty much ungodly next level, especially to do it consistently game after game as an average. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And during that time, he was also throwing 2.5 touchdown passes a game. And so you might think, well, that's lower than his average. And what that's telling you is that the second half is going to be worse. And indeed it is. He goes from 109.1 to 98.8. So in the last 3 years of his career, he has gone down by more than 10 points of passer rating on average. That's a big degradation. And it's interesting that it's split so finely first half, second half. And we're going to look at some graphs to see why it is the way it is. And in the second half, he's also throwing 2.1 a game. So he's dropped off in terms of his production, throwing touchdowns, and in terms of his overall production and performance as a passer. Here's a graph that shows all of those things I just said and a couple more even that illustrate the point I'm trying to make, which is if you look at, let's start from the top. If you look at his passer rating year over year, it is a general downward trend. He has up years, he has down years, but in general, despite the highs and the lows, it is consistently going down. The same is true of the Chiefs' winning percentage, and you can see it tracks his passer rating pretty well. When he has a good year, the Chiefs have a good year. When he has a little bit of a down year, the Chiefs have a little bit of a down year, but never down enough not to make the playoffs, and that's going to be important later. The only thing that's super consistent is his completion percentage. That is straight as an arrow, very, very, deadly consistent with his completion percentages. It's what makes him one of the best players of all time, is his ability to consistently hit his targets. But let's look at the last piece of this graph, which is his passing touchdown. This is just a count over the years. He obviously started off on a high. He had a little bit of a sophomore slump, and then he's been consistently, at the same rate. I don't want to look at this statistic too much just because it's much more variable. I mean, it depends on how well your receivers are doing. Obviously, the last year, even though they won the Super Bowl, he had a terrible receiving corps. It's probably why you're seeing a downturn in a lot of these things. And that's also one thing that I want to get at, is that this first half, second half dichotomy is probably driven by 2 points. And that is the first year of his career where he was excellent, had an insane passer rating, and his most recent year, which was not good. He did not have a good passer rating, the worst of his career, in fact, and he threw not very many touchdowns by his standards, and the Chiefs didn't do very well in the regular season. And that's another point. These are all regular season stats. And so it's difficult to draw conclusions, especially in such a small sample size where the differences are definitely being driven by the outliers. And in this case, there's a high outlier in the first half of his career, and there's a low outlier in the second half. But I think the bigger takeaway that we should get from these graphs is that even though there's a high and there's a low, it's temporally oriented. And that is to say that over time, it's generally trending downwards. Not quickly, he's not falling off a cliff, but it is trending downwards. The fall of Patrick Mahomes. Now, up to this point, I've been making the case that it's been down, down, down. But that's actually not the whole story. We all know the success he's had, but where has he had success? Not really in the regular season. I mean, he's had plenty of that. But where his success truly lies is in the postseason. Part 2 of the story of Patrick Mahomes and his career has to do with the difference between his regular season play and his postseason play. He is a master at saving his best for the end. And you can see that in some of the statistics. So as we've said, his career passer rating average is 103.3, but in the playoffs, it goes up to 105.8. It's difficult to know where this difference comes from. Is he really performing all that better? Is he really going above and beyond in terms of his effort level or his intensity or his preparation? I would guess probably there's some of that. There's also probably some of Andy Reid knowing what to put on film and knowing when to use his best punches for big games and big moments to get the touchdown he needs. But you also expect in the playoffs that defenses are going to be better, faster, and better schemed than in the regular season, because the games mean so much more. And so defensive coordinators are trying just as hard. So if we assume that everybody is trying just as hard or harder in the playoffs, and that everybody's level rises, then it still means that Patrick Mahomes is elevating his game above and beyond that. And I think that it really shows. He knows what to exploit. He's probably played this team before in the regular season at some point, and so he's logged away all these things to exploit. He knows what plays are going to damage the defense. He knows what schemes they're going to use, etc., etc., etc. And there's another interesting thing, which is that his interceptions per game go from 0.7 in the regular season to 0.4. And what this is telling us, it might not seem like a lot, but interceptions happen so infrequently that even a difference this small is meaningful, because what this tells us is he is cutting down on his errors. He's cutting down on his risk, and he's making sure that he's making the right plays every single time. I also looked at his touchdown passes, and it doesn't change in any substantial way from the regular season to the postseason. So he's not seeing an reduction in production in terms of touchdowns. He's not seeing an increase in production. It's staying the same, but he is seeing an decrease in risk, a decrease in the negative outcomes of a pass. That's huge. In general, an interception is more harmful to your team than a touchdown pass is beneficial to your team, because we know the cost of a touchdown pass. It's 6 points, right? But it's not quite as clear for an interception for a couple of reasons. One is, not only did you give up your opportunity to potentially score, like let's say that's between 3 and 6 points because you could either get a field goal or a touchdown, you've also given up field position because throwing an interception is not nearly as good as punting the ball away and getting better defensive field position. Additionally, on top of robbing your chance to score, you've now given the opposition a chance to score with good field position where the expected value of that possession is high, really high. So instead of a swing of just 6 points or 3 points or some other low number of points that you could imagine, it's actually an expected swing of more than a touchdown in terms of point differential. And that's what you care about. At the end of the game, you need your point differential to be positive rather than negative. And if you're taking a huge opportunity 4 points and giving the other team a huge opportunity 4 points, the expected return in point differential is terrible for your team. Patrick knows this. He throws fewer interceptions. He doesn't throw more touchdown passes because that's easier said than done, and because he knows that taking more risk and trying to throw more touchdown passes at the risk of throwing more interceptions is a negative overall net outcome. To further illustrate this point, we've come to my favorite graph. This is my favorite graph because it shows the difference in stark contrast between the postseason and the regular season. So you see, we already saw the regular season. It's sort of just a downward trend. But the postseason is particularly interesting. We're going to go year by year because this one, there's a lot to unpack. In his first year, he has his best season by pretty much any metric you can think of. He threw a buttload of touchdown passes. He had an incredible passer rating. But what happened? They got to the postseason and they didn't really go anywhere. And as you can see, he had a worse postseason performance than he did for the regular season on average. And I think that this was the first hint to Patrick Mahomes, who's a very smart guy, that actually it doesn't really matter if you perform super well in the regular season. That doesn't lead to success necessarily. And this is further illustrated by his second year of full-time starting. In this season, he took a drastic hit in terms of his regular season performance. He throws way fewer touchdowns. His passer rating is not nearly as good. But they have postseason success. And I think this is the beginning of him and Andy Reid and probably Travis Kelce as well, figuring out something about football, which is you have to bring your best games when they matter most. Having a great game in the regular season means nothing compared to having a great game in the divisional round or in the conference round. Like, the return on investment is just way higher in the postseason. And I think that's something they figured out. Let's pull our punches in the regular season. Let's save them, because when we need them, they'll be there. And they won't be on film, and the other teams will not be expecting necessarily. It's also important to point out that for the first 4 years of this, he had Tyreek Hill. For the last 2, he has not. So that could also be weighing in here, but it doesn't seem to affect his overall numbers or trends all that much. Let's look at the third season. In the third season, again, he has a much better regular season performance than his postseason performance. And what happens? He loses in the Super Bowl. This just hammers home the point that the regular season is not the important thing, that the postseason is. And in year 4, this is the most interesting year of the 6, because he does everything right. He has a okay regular season. I mean, by his standards, it's not good, but by everybody else's standard, it's a good season. And he's able to elevate his game. I mean, he goes on a tear in the postseason, and especially in the game that he loses against Joe Burrow. He has an incredible game. It boosts his this passer rating by a lot, but he loses, and so this is another huge lesson I think that he took away, which is the difference in that game. In that game, Patrick Mahomes threw 2 interceptions. Joe Burrow only threw 1. And you might be thinking, like, that's probably a small difference. Well, they lost in OT. That interception was the difference in the game. They could have won it in regulation if he hadn't thrown the interception. And I think everything falls into place at this point. In year 4, he's realizing, okay, not only do I need to elevate my game in the postseason, I need to reduce the risk, because that's going to hurt my team more than taking a risk is going to help my team potentially. And the last 2 years, all this experience, the not doing as good in the postseason, the doing better and seeing success, the realization that interceptions are the thing that kills your team, it comes to fruition. And in the last 2 seasons, he has been doing, I'm not going to say bare minimum, but he has been doing not quite as well in the regular season as he had in previous years, but really bringing it for the postseason. And he's won 2 Super Bowls in a row off of that experience and off of that knowledge. This season is a little up in the air. He's not playing super well. It's very early in the season. Who knows what kind of success they're going to have later. I don't know if he's going to be doubling down on this, like be mediocre in the regular season, turn it up for the playoffs, take everybody off guard. I don't know if he's going to end up going with that strategy. But I'm excited to see. This is sort of a proof of concept year for him and Andy Reid, to see if they can put something together, even though their team is probably not quite as good as in previous years. Of course, with all this stuff, there's other factors that come into play. You know, there's receivers. He had a terrible receiving core last year. There's defense. His defense has always been really good. They have a great defensive coordinator. All those things factor in. But it's interesting to look at his success and his performance in the postseason compared to the regular season, and how that leads to Chiefs' success and Chiefs' performance. And finally, to end the video, I wanted to make a quick comparison between 2 quarterbacks who couldn't be more different in terms of their success. Now, in terms of their performance, it's actually kind of debatable as to who's the better regular season performer. Dak has been steadily increasing. He had a drop in year 5. By the way, this is 2018 to 2023, so it excludes the first couple of years of his career. But he has been steadily improving his performance, and then he drops off in year 5, and then he comes way back in year 6. And of course, there's a bunch of factors that lead into this, but basically they have opposite trends. Pat Mahomes is declining in the regular season in terms of his performance, and Dak is getting better, and yet their postseason success couldn't be more different. Dak has really never had success in the postseason. Why? Because his play almost always is worse than it was in the regular season. Meanwhile, Patrick has really figured out that he can have mediocre to decent to, I mean, obviously he's a great quarterback. He has above average years every single year. But in terms of his own gold standard, he can come short of that in the regular season as long as he exceeds it in the postseason. And I think that this is something that Dak and the Cowboys really need to figure out. If you know you're going to make the playoffs and you're playing well enough to make the playoffs, don't show your best plays. Don't put it all out on the field, right? I know every football game is super important to every fan, but it probably shouldn't be that important to every player and every coach, because in the grand scheme of it, there's 17 of them. You have to win a certain number to get to the playoffs, but those in the playoffs mean a million times more than those in the regular season. And this point is best illustrated by this graph. As you can see, he missed the playoffs 2 years in a row, but in that first year, he underperforms his regular season. In that 4th year, he way underperforms his regular season. In the 5th year, he kind of figures out, does better than he had. And that was their most successful year of any of these 6. They still don't get it done. That's just the Cowboys for you. And in the most recent year, yeah, huge difference. Not nearly as good. I think that it also has to do with coaching, but Dak himself is not performing up to expectations. Maybe it's just not him. I think Patrick's experience, I think that his knowledge of this concept that you should be performing at a higher clip when it matters really helps him, and his experience and wherewithal to know exactly when the chips are down. I don't think everybody has it, to be honest. And I'm not the biggest Patrick fan, to be honest. I was rooting for the Niners last year, but man, it's really hard not to appreciate him as a really super high level player when you look at the numbers and you see like just how smart he is zoomed out, like not even just how smart he is on every play, how smart he is to know what matters and what doesn't. That's pretty much all I got for the quote-unquote fall of Patrick Mahomes. Misleading title. I'm trying to get you guys with clickbait. Let me know if it worked. This was really fun to do. Much more descriptive, much more qualitative. But I think that it was a good exercise in how statistics can be misleading. Yeah, anyways. Numbers lie, but homies don't. So we'll see you guys in the next one.